And she speaks in direct voice to her husband and to the men in the room. And I found her speech very, very moving and very interesting. So in my commonplace book, hopefully you can see this in what I've done here. I put the date down that I recorded the entry. I transcribed the passage letter for letter, including all the punctuation marks. I put the citation there, Libby ab urbe condita, from the Foundation of the City, 158. And then in terms of trying to figure out what interested me about this passage, I tried to think about what was it that really captured my attention here. And it was the fact that Lucretia spoke in a direct voice, that we're able to hear her as a character in the context of Livy's longer narrative. So I assigned it to the category here that you can see, female speech. And that constituted my first category. And I asked my students to record at least 10 throughout the semester. Since I defined my first category then, I knew that other passages that I read throughout the semester, having put the syllabus together myself, were going to fall into this category naturally. So I ended up skipping about 5 pages or so when I made my next entry, pardon me here, that was based on an article by Sandra Josh L., The Body Female and the Body Politic, Livy's Lucretia and Virginia from 2002, wherein she talks about the ways in which women's bodies become spaces on which Roman history gets inscribed. And I was really interested in the way that gender and politics intersected in the quote that I chose. So hence entry number 2 here. From Sandra Joshell and the category gender and politics. And as I created more categories, I marked out where the categories began with these little flags on the side here, left about 5 blank pages so that I can enter more passages as time went on, made sure that each passage was in a different color so that I can tell them apart. That's basically how I kept my, my commonplace book. I ended up with 10 categories by the end of the semester that will be not, my categories included things like female, gender and politics, sexuality and identity, off-limits sexual objects, patriarchal control, gender politics then and now, toxic or fragile masculinity, erasing women's voices, that sort of went hand in hand with the female speech category, activity and passivity, and bodily integrity. Throughout the course, I constantly checked in with my students and made constant reference to the things that I was putting in my own commonplace book in terms of things that I found interesting that they might have found interesting as well as we discussed these passages in class. At 3 points in the semester, at the 1/3 mark about week 5, the 2/3 mark about week 10 out of 14, and during the final exam period at the end of the semester, my students were supposed to evaluate their books in their current states to ensure that they were keeping up with the requisite number of entries and to change or adapt elements that weren't working. For example, categories that ended up being too narrow or narrower than expected. The first 2 analyses out of the 3 ask students to explain the physical or electronic structure of their books and their entry-making processes. And they also ask my students to choose one of their categories and compare the entries within it in terms of theme, content, and language in about 300 to 400 words. The third and final analysis, due at the end of the semester, incorporated the pragmatic details of the first 2 analyses. Do you have enough entries? What are your categories? And so on. But replaced that single category comparison of entries with a reflective essay that was supposed to span the entire book, ideally about 6 to 8 pages double-spaced, that was prompted as follows. And here I'm quoting from the Google Doc that's been linked in the chat. Write a reflective essay that answers the following question. What aspect of Roman gender and sexuality did you find the most interesting this semester? And then the rest of this quotation sort of fills out that main question. While this doesn't have to be a formal essay, you might think of your answer to the question as your thesis, which you will have to support and illustrate using the evidence of the entries and the categories in your Liber. Why was this aspect so interesting to you? How do your entries and categories inform or enrich your understanding of that aspect of Roman gender and sexuality? Do your entries help indicate a difference between that aspect of Roman gender and sexuality and its counterpart, or lack thereof, in modern gender and sexuality? What themes have emerged across the different entries and categories? Are there any points of resonance between different categories themselves? End quote. Students were supposed to cite at least 12 passages from their books to illustrate their answer to the main question, and that guideline of 6 to 8 pages double-spaced was more of a suggestion than a strict requirement. If they could answer that question in 4 to 5 pages while citing 12 passages, then great. If they were super passionate about their topic and needed to take up 10 to 12 pages to express their thoughts, then that was great too. I deliberately worded the question capaciously enough And again, that question was, what aspect of Roman gender and sexuality did you find the most interesting this semester? I tried to word that capaciously enough that students could take their answer in whatever direction they wanted. I was banking on the hypothesis that what students would find interesting in Roman gender and sexuality in our readings and in our discussions throughout the semester would be filtered through their experience of gender and sexuality in the present day. The question's open-ended nature also allowed my students to bring their individual experiences and interests to their reflection. What I find interesting would necessarily differ from what one of my students found interesting, and vice versa. I wanted to give them the space to write about their own truth and explore something that meant something to them, rather than imposing a prescriptive prompt for some sort of argumentative research essay. Luckily, my hypothesis seemed to have been proven correct based on the results of their projects and their reflections on them afterward. One student used our semester's readings to reflect on the ways in which toxic masculinity influenced their upbringing. Another student compared modern constructions of victim blaming with ancient notions and evinced a special kind of masculine self-victimization in our ancient sources that women, typically victimized by external forces, did not exhibit. For another student, this seminar was their first chance to think about gender and sexuality on a deep level at all, let alone in ancient culture. They reflected on how thoroughly considerations of gender and sexuality permeate both ancient and modern culture in places they didn't necessarily expect. I may have done too good a job demonstrating in class my own personal research interest in narratology, as evidenced by the student who reflected on the ways in which speech and silence illustrate various levels of power and hierarchies of agency in our texts. Another student investigated the anxieties latent in certain modes of gender performance and the policing of those norms, both in the ancient context and in their own daily existence in the modern day. My students thought deeply and engaged sensitively with our semester sources to produce truly insightful and impactful reflections, and their conclusions demonstrated that this student-centered approach to assessment yielded some amazing benefits. In my capacity as the professor of the course, I naturally possess a degree of power over course elements like readings, grading structures, and classroom discussion moderation. But in yielding power over the content of my students' commonplace books and their eventual reflections, and allowing them to drive their trajectories through the course material and their syntheses and analyses of it, I created an opportunity for them to express their individuality and make important connections between the ancient world and our own. My students were game for the challenge, and in reflecting on the course and the project specifically, they seemed to get out of it exactly what I was hoping for: an opportunity to read closely, think deeply, synthesize organically, and reflect personally. One comment on the course evaluation stated the following, quote, I really enjoyed the Liber Personalis because it allowed us to log our ideas on the readings every class and reflect on it ourselves. I think that the act of writing thoughts down in a journal really allows for deeper thinking about the coursework, end quote. Another stated, quote, the structure of the Liber Personalis assignment was most valuable because it allowed me to engage with the class material in a way that I had complete control over and was meaningful for me. The long-form self-directed project really fit well into the structure of the course, class, end quote. In a broader reflection on the course as a whole, another student stated, quote, I was already pretty interested in gender and sexuality in the ancient world. The semi-self-paced and self-motivated design of this course let me focus on the topics within that overarching theme that really struck me personally and allowed me to investigate them in ways that mattered to me, end quote. Approaching the course material from a personal perspective raises the stakes of interpretation and creates space for students to explore the material in personally meaningful ways. The structure of the commonplace book assignment allowed my students to make their own decisions about what was worth analyzing and investigating. And by centering their perspectives and intellectual curiosities as lenses through which they could analyze our course materials, with a project that had no right or wrong answer, that was built incrementally throughout the semester and evaluated regularly, they arrived at conclusions that reinforced and deepened what they had learned throughout the semester and armed them with new tools with which to engage their present environments. In the grand scheme of things, one semester end assignment in one college course doesn't amount to a whole lot in the context of a global pandemic. But if the commonplace book assignment provided an opportunity for my students to continue to explore and to learn about the ancient world, despite the anxieties, stresses, and the worries of the modern world around them, then the commonplace book did this job well. Thank you.